Social learning and communication, vocal learning. Chapter 12 presented research and findings on natural communication, but one aspect of communication, the vocal learning that results in behaviors such as birdsong, fits squarely in a chapter on social learning. Social learning by birds is a well-studied example of how the development of a communication system can critically depend on social interaction. The first part of this section will consider song development. Later, the question of how to characterize this form of social learning will be addressed. Birdsong acquisition. Though many bird species produce sounds, not all sounds are songs. Song refers to species-typical musical vocalizations that are primarily produced during the mating season by males of the order Passeriformes. Songs can play an important role in territory defense and attracting females, and for many species of songbird, we now know that the development of species-typical song depends on social interaction with conspecifics. In some of the most studied species, this interaction begins soon after hatching in the spring or summer, a time during which mature males are producing song. A good proportion of what is currently known about birdsong learning stems from the work of Thorpe, Marler, and their colleagues, and much attention has been paid to one particular species, the white-crowned sparrow. Male white-crowned sparrows have a single song, and that song is shared with neighbors. However, across geographical areas, the songs will differ, meaning that there are local dialects, which in turn was an early clue that some form of social learning was at work. In the laboratory, white-crowned sparrows raised in isolation will come to produce songs. These songs start off disorganized and varied, but then begin to have some elements of the species' typical song. They are, however, abnormal. In contrast, if isolated birds hear a recorded playback of species' typical song during a sensitive period, 10 to 50 days of age, they will develop a song similar to the one they experienced. This occurs even if the song to which they are exposed comes from a different dialect area than the one in which their parents lived. Importantly, young white-crowned sparrows will not learn the songs of other species of songbird. There appears to be something special about how the songs of one's own species are processed. It is even the case that isolated birds who have never heard their own species' song will show increased heart rate and begging behavior when first exposed to a recording of the song. Thus, the songbirds may be predisposed to discriminate their own species' song. This finding, combined with the fact that even isolated birds produce song that, though abnormal, has some similarity to a typical song, suggests that the social learning of birdsong builds from an existing sensory template that may be unlearned. With exposure to species-typical song during the sensitive period, young birds develop song production in phases. First, they produce variable sounds, a type of sub-song that has been likened to human babbling. Later, more structured plastic songs are produced which contain elements of the song they are being exposed to. Finally, the song becomes crystallized and will be similar to the song of the tutor, demonstrator, to which they had the most exposure. This social learning process appears to be supplemented by experience in hearing one's own song production. Birds deafened after exposure to a tutor's song produce aberrant songs. The neurocircuitry of birdsong learning is arguably the most well-defined system in the field of social learning. The song system has been proposed to include neural pathways from the motoric behavior of sound production, the perceptual learning of sounds, and the comparison of heard sounds and the internal template. Research in this area is ongoing and includes single-cell recordings that indicate the equivalent of mirror neurons, cells that fire when a bird is currently singing or listening to a bird sing the same song. Figure 13.4 depicts the neural substrates for song learning. Figure 13.4, the song system of the songbird brain. While the specifics of the system go beyond the focus of this chapter, some details are provided here. The pathway that includes the HVC, the robust nucleus of the archostriatum, RA, and the hypoglossal nucleus, NXIITS, which projects to the strynx, the vocal organ, is involved in the production of song throughout life. The rostral pathway that includes the HVC, the lateral magnocellular nucleus of the anterior neostriatum, LMAN, area X, and the dorsolateral thalamus, DLM, is thought to have a role in song learning. The field L complex is the primary forebrain auditory area, which in turn projects to other auditory areas. Changes in birdsong over time. Over the last 30 years, savanna sparrows have been studied on Kent Island in the Bay of Fundy, New Brunswick, Canada. Individual birds are known, and many generations of song production have been recorded. During this period of time, researchers have found changes in the species' typical song. The savanna sparrow song has multiple segments, and all but one of these segments has undergone change. For example, one part of the song, a trill at the end that differs slightly across males, appears to be particularly important for females as they choose mates. What this means is that the mate choice behavior of females can actually have some effect on the song styles learned by young males, and thus can influence changes in the song over time. Specifically, female savanna sparrows tend to prefer males who produce a shorter trill at the end of the song, and these males show higher reproductive success. Additionally, some researchers have suggested that young males who are learning song will preferentially learn the song patterns of reproductively successful neighboring males. In time, then, the most common song form in a region can begin to change, spearheaded by the mate choice behavior of the females. In contrast, one segment of the savanna sparrow song has remained unchanged over the decades. A buzz segment that occurs before the trill still retains the same features as it did when observation began. Williams and her colleagues suggest that this segment may serve to define the species or the local dialect of the island population. In fact, similar unchanged segments occur in white-crowned sparrow song. It is possible that, along with a bias to copy song elements of successful males, another learning bias exists for segments that do not differentiate successful and unsuccessful males, copy the most common form that is heard. Thus, changes in birdsong over time may provide examples of directed social learning and conformity. Is vocal learning a special type of social learning? There is no dispute that birdsong learning is an example of vocal learning that is dependent on social experience, but how to characterize the learning process is still a matter of discussion. Some researchers will refer to the behavior as mimicry or imitation. However, many are quick to point out the differences between vocal learning and visually learned behaviors that are traditionally described using these terms. For example, Zentel 2011 refers to song learning as a special case of social learning, pointing out two important differences. First, as detailed above, birdsong learning is built upon a foundation of species-typical behavior, and thus, the social learning occurs in a very constrained manner. When compared to the types of behaviors learned from conspecifics in relation to object use, this constrained learning appears quite different. Second, vocal learning is unique in that a learner can hear its own vocalization and compare it to the memory of the demonstrator's vocalization. That is, the stimulus produced by the demonstrator and the stimulus produced by the observer can be closely matched, which is not always the case in visual imitation, and may create an easier perceptual or cognitive process that is specific to vocal learning. Box 13.3, Learning Human Speech Sounds, Perceptual Narrowing of Phonemes. There are several reports of human children who were deprived of linguistic input, neither human vocal speech nor sign language, and subsequently failed to develop language. One famous child is Victor, who was named the Wild Child after being found abandoned living in the woods near Aveyron, France in 1800. When discovered at around 12 years of age, Victor could make various sounds, but had no language. After many years of socialization, Victor only gained a few words. His story and that of others, e.g. Jeannie, a more modern wild child, dramatically emphasized the important role of social learning in language development. Language development has been extensively studied by developmental psychologists, and of course, current knowledge goes well beyond the scope of this book. One aspect, however, points to an interesting process underlying the social learning of speech sounds, or phonemes. Learning human speech requires the ability to distinguish among phonemes, an ability that is present in infancy. However, a difference between infants and adults' discrimination of speech sounds is that young infants are actually better at it. Consider that any one language uses only a subsect of the larger number of phonemes that can exist. Adults do not perceive differences among some speech sounds that do not appear in their native language, yet, using various experimental measures, like looking time duration, researchers have found that young infants can distinguish among all phonemes that have been tested. At this point, then, the early discrimination of speech sounds appears to not rely on social learning. Young infants can discriminate sounds that they have never heard before. However, this discrimination ability does not last past approximately 9 to 10 months of age. In a clever set of experiments, Worker and her colleagues demonstrated the loss of discrimination of certain phonemes that are part of the Hindi language if infants were being raised in exclusively English-speaking homes. Infants were tested in a conditioning procedure in which they learned that a change in a series of sounds would correspond with the appearance of an interesting toy to their right. Predictive head turns would thus indicate that a phoneme distinction was made. Only young infants appeared to perceive the distinction among certain phonemes in Hindi. Older infants and adults had great difficulty in noticing a difference. What appears to be happening is that infants begin to focus their social learning to the most common speech sounds in their environment. This perceptual narrowing seems to result in greater expertise in the predominant language. Thus, for humans, social learning of speech sounds may be enhanced by a tuning of perceptual systems to the most frequent, and thus potentially the most relevant, sounds occurring in the environment. Others suggest that song learning may be an example of end-state emulation. Birds that are listening to other songs may be, in effect, copying the final result. A full understanding of the social learning processes that characterize song learning will require further testing, but it may be the case that increased knowledge of the neuronal bases of both vocal and visual forms of social learning will shed light on the similarities and differences of the underlying processes. Learning to use objects. In 1911, Thorndike's experiments with puzzle boxes revealed that cats could learn by trial and error how to open a latch to escape a box. In other experiments, Thorndike allowed cats to observe other cats opening the box before being tested themselves. He reasoned that if imitation had occurred, the observing cats would have escaped faster than cats with no prior observation, but no such facilitation was evident. Even if observing cats had shown an advantage, we now know that one of many possible social learning mechanisms could account for the behavior, including stimulus enhancement of the latch. At the end of the 1900s and to the present, the study of social learning has continued to focus on the question of whether true imitation is evident in animals and human children. Now, however, researchers are armed with a set of carefully controlled laboratory methodologies and a battery of social learning mechanisms to consider as they examine what type of learning might best characterize the development of certain behaviors. Much of this work studies the manner in which animals and human children learn to manipulate objects, often inspired by the evidence for social learning of tool use in the wild. From this research, new insight has been gained into the conditions under which imitation appears to occur, as well as the potential abilities that are unique to humans and may serve to support culture. Testing for imitation, bidirectional control, and two-action procedures. Examining imitation depends on carefully controlled experiments, yet it has been notoriously difficult to find a way to rule out the various non-imitative forms of social learning. One attempt has been the bidirectional control procedure, in which an observer watches a demonstrator move an object in one of two possible directions to obtain a goal. Hayes and Dawson, 1990, for example, trained one group of rats to serve as demonstrators. These rats learned to move a pole either to the left or to the right. After watching a demonstrator, observers subsequently pushed the pole in the direction they had observed. At first glance, the observers would appear to be engaging in imitation. Both the end state and the specific actions that were used to bring about that state were replicated. However, it is possible that rats were engaging in emulation in the form of affordance learning. That is, they may have learned that the pole could be moved in a specific way. To control for affordance learning, a follow-up study moved the pole's location to a perpendicular wall in the testing chamber such that now, to push in the correct direction, rats would have to have encoded the direction of the push relative to the body. Rats in this condition continued to move the pole in the direction that had been observed, and the authors interpreted the results as indicative of imitative learning. Further study, however, revealed that the rat's behavior may have had more to do with attraction to odor cues present on one side of the pole than actual imitation. Despite this rocky start, the bidirectional control procedure has been used in recent years with novel controls and with a species for which odor cues are less important, namely the pigeon. Klein and Zentel, 2003, for example, have found that pigeons will push a sliding door to the left or to the right, depending on the direction a demonstrating bird has previously pushed. Figure 13.5. A control for affordance learning was also included, in which the door slid in one of the two directions independently via a hidden experimenter. In this ghost condition, affordance learning was still possible. However, matching the push direction could not be said to occur via imitation. Two other conditions controlled for social facilitation: by having another bird present while the door was moved on its own, and odor and sound cues, by having the actions blocked from view. Pigeons were most likely to push in the observed direction after observing a conspecific push, providing evidence for imitation. Interestingly, though, pigeons also pushed in the matching direction in the ghost condition when no other pigeon was present, yet to a lesser extent. One interpretation of this pattern of results is that pigeons can imitate, but will also engage in affordance learning in the absence of a demonstrator. Figure 13.5, Testing Arena for Klein and Zentel, 2003. The observing pigeons pushed a sliding door, the screen, to the left or to the right to obtain food, depending on the direction a demonstrating bird had previously pushed. So there's like two kind of boxes next to each other, but the birds can see each other. So there's the observer chamber with one bird and the demonstrator chamber with one bird. And on the side of the demonstrator chamber, there's a house light, a feeder opening, and a screen. Okay, so you're watching which way the other bird moves the screen to get food. A second testing procedure has been developed that may control for emulation more effectively than the bidirectional control procedure. In the two-action test, the object moves in the same manner, but the action used to cause the movement differs across demonstrators. That is, in contrast to the bidirectional procedure, the affordances remain the same, but observers will differ in terms of what specific actions they witness. For example, Aikens and Zentel, 1996, trained Japanese quail demonstrators to use either a stepping or pecking motion to move a treadle to obtain food. Observers then watched a demonstrator obtain food. If an observer watched stepping motion, it also engaged in stepping motion, but if pecking was observed, the observer subsequently pecked. Similar results were found with pigeons. A two-action task such as this can rule out emulation by affordance learning because the object's movement was exactly the same across conditions, i.e. the treadle moved in the same way. Thus, the birds appear to have encoded the demonstrator's actions. Additionally, Zentel 2012 points out that there is little visual similarity between what the observer witnesses during the demonstration phase and what is seen when they have the opportunity to manipulate the treadle, e.g. they cannot necessarily see their foot touch the treadle given the position of the eyes. For this reason, it is unlikely that the results are due to simply moving in such a way as to match two visual stimuli. Chimpanzees, children, and artificial fruit. Because human children are such good imitators, it has been tempting to assume that ape species, our closest living relatives, would also be good at aping. Yet, results from variants on the two-action test just described have indicated some intriguing similarities and differences. Whited and colleagues have pioneered studies using what they have called artificial fruit, transparent boxes that can be opened in various manners to obtain fruit, figure 13.6. In one version, for example, 2 bolts hold the box closed, and chimpanzees or children, aged 2 to 4 years, individually watched a human adult demonstrator either pull or poke the bolts out and open the box. The participants were then given a newly baited box and allowed to try to open it. Figure 13.6. Artificial fruit used to examine social learning in chimpanzees and young human children. In this version, participants observed a human demonstrator either pull or poke out bolts in order to unlock the box and obtain food. Children copied the actions of their demonstrator with the most fidelity, and while the chimpanzees were also more likely to use the observed action, they showed less exact copying. One obvious question is whether chimpanzees would show greater fidelity if they had observed a conspecific initially demonstrate the box, but even in this case, results remained the same. Thus, human children may be more predisposed to closely copy the actions of demonstrators, a finding that will be elaborated on in the next section and box 13.4. As for the chimpanzees, some have suggested that the lower fidelity copying is actually indicative of emulation, perhaps via object movement reenactment. That is, they may not have learned about the actions, but instead learned that the bolts could move in a certain way. The behavior of capuchin monkeys in a similar task addresses this interpretation. Custance et al. 1999 found that monkeys copied the direction of movement of the bolts, but not the manner in which they were handled. For example, they would sometimes pull the bolts out from the back instead of poking them out. However, chimpanzees were not observed to engage in this type of behavior.